Good morning, everyone. We were going through some of the examples put forward by realists about shareable universals in order to challenge the nominalists to provide translations that would translate away the abstract terms and replace them with terms that refer to concrete things. So, for example, suppose it was the realists put forward, say, that red is a color. All right, so this seems to say that there exists something which is referred to by the word red. Red isn't any kind of physical object or thing. Indeed, it's clear that it's some kind of shareable abstract quality, since many different things can have the property or quality of redness. So if someone says red is a color, or that's short for redness as a color, maybe I should make that explicit just to make it even clearer. Redness is a color, or you could have greenness as a color or whatever. Wouldn't make any difference. So the nominalist task is to come up with a translation of this such that it's equivalent to the original and either means the very same thing as the original or unpacks what the original means, plausibly. So what might the nominalist respond with? The translation can only refer to concrete things. So instead of referring to redness and color, it has to talk about red things and colored things. So they could translate it then as what? Say, all red things are colored things. And they could plausibly say that this first statement is just a fancy or highfalutin way of saying what can be said more simply as all red things are colored things. So this translation would get rid of the abstract terms, the abstract noun color and red or redness, and replace it with terms whose reference is concrete. Red things and colored things are concrete things, like tables and books and so on. And those two statements would be equivalent and seem to pretty much say the same thing. So that would be a plausible case favoring the nominalist solution, right? In this particular example. So the conclusion may be drawn that this example, at least, doesn't provide any strong motivation for introducing redness as an entity over and above red things. Both statements in this case would be necessarily true. It's necessarily true that red is a color, and necessarily true that all red things are colored things. So they're equivalent. And the first statement doesn't really seem to tell us very much more than that necessarily all red things are colored things, except that it tells us that there exists an abstract universal of redness and an abstract universal of color. But if we follow Occam and want to have the simplest or most economical ontology or theory of what exists, we would say that the second statement, the translation, is superior on those grounds in that it only commits us to the existence of concrete things, but not to the existence of abstract things, which seems to be the more economical view, since it looks like if we believe in abstract things like redness, we're also going to believe in concrete things which exemplify those. So the first statement's going to land us with both abstract and concrete things, whereas the second statement could fit within a concretist or nominalistic or particularistic theory. So, however, a second example could be that, say, could say that redness resembles orangeness more than it resembles greenness. That seems to be a common sense truth. So redness resembles orangeness more than it resembles greenness. This too seems like a necessary truth. Doesn't seem to be a contingent fact that there's this resemblance, which is very interesting. But there are these necessary truths about similarity or resemblance that hold among these colors. But this refers to abstract entities, so how could this be rephrased so that we only refer to concrete entities? We might try 2 prime, what would be the obvious first attempt for the nominalist. Red things resemble orange things more than they resemble green things. Something like that. But will that be equivalent to the original? They're only equivalent if necessarily one of them is true, if and only if the other of them is true. But I think we're going to see on reflection that the second statement's not necessarily true, which would mean we wouldn't have our translation yet. So suppose you have a red Honda, like a car, right? And then you have a green Honda, right? And then you've got over here the third thing, which is like an orange-colored orange, like a piece of fruit. It seems like the red Honda resembles the green Honda more than either of them resemble the orange piece of fruit. So that won't work as a translation of that. Does that sound right to you? Because the preponderance of resemblance is taken over in the fact that they're both cars. That's a much stronger resemblance than the mere color, which seems to be kind of accidental to the things, whereas the fact that they're cars makes them a lot more similar despite the discrepancy in color, whatever. Especially as regards like a living thing like the orange piece of fruit, whatever. Right, or part of a living thing. Well, it would be a living thing, but it's not an organism. It doesn't seem to be. The orange is sort of like the reproductive, part of the reproductive system of a orange tree. But at a certain point, it's a living part of the organism. Right, so that won't work. So what's the nominalist to do? They've got to either throw up their hands and say, you win, there really are colors, or they have to come up with a better translation. So that's how the game gets played. So they might say, well, red things resemble orange things in color more than they resemble green things. So what's the red flag here, if I can use a mixed metaphor? The use of the phrase in color. That would seem to be it would seem question begging to use that here. It seems to presuppose that there are colors, which takes us back to believing in abstract entities again, like colors. So that's no good. So I guess there are different flaws these kinds of translations can have. They can fail to be equivalent, or they can use some term in them which is somehow suspect. One way it can be suspect is that it just begs the question by presupposing that there are shareable properties like colors, getting us nowhere in the translation. So they'd have to try a 2 triple prime. All right, so what could that be? Well, in the book, I try this, which I think does provide a translation in purely nominalistic terms. Though there are some issues that can be raised about it, but I think it probably would be serviceable. So we could say more complexly. And at this point, it starts to become less plausible that what we have here is actually a synonymy with the original statement. Like, can we really say that the first statement, that the first statement is just a fancy way of saying what the translation says? I kind of doubt it here. As they become more complex, that becomes more implausible. But you can still say that the translation unpacks or analyzes the meaning of the first, and that's good enough, so long as it's equivalent to the original, logically equivalent to the original. So you could say if X is a red thing, so here we're just talking not about redness, but just about red things, right? And Y is a green thing. I mean, and Y is an orange thing. Okay. And Z is a green thing. So, given that conditional, right, that if all those conditions hold, and if X, Y, and Z are as similar to one another as a red, orange, and green thing can be. Okay, so what that's going to do is rule out that case of the orange and the orange and the green and the red Hondas, because then that condition wouldn't be met. The three of them wouldn't all be as similar as a red, green, and orange thing could be. So it's going to say that all three things have to be as similar as they can be otherwise with respect to other aspects of them other than color. So and if X, Y, and Z are as similar to one another as a red, orange, and green thing can be. Okay, so if all that's the case, then what? X resembles Y more than it resembles Z. That seems to give you a nominalistic translation. The only thing I want to note here is that you do have to use the word can, which is a modal term. It's basically synonymous with possibility here. Now I think that's okay. The term possible doesn't in and of itself involve any reference to an abstract entity. There might be some other argument from possibility that says that possibility can only be understood in terms of abstract entities or something. Though we've seen that's disputable, right? David Lewis argued that we could understand possibility in terms of a concrete model. So that argument, we put those disputes off to one side here. And we could say, well, okay, so we've got a translation. Leaving aside that we may have further disputes about possibility. But possibility in of itself might be taken as a primitive, undefined term. There's a term could or possible. I really shouldn't say possibility, that's an abstract noun. Sounds like a universal. But just the use of the prefix or predicate is possible. Doesn't refer to any abstract object like redness or greenness or anything like that. So it looks like we could get a translation for this in that way. So what other examples might the realists put forward? Well, we had one at the end of last period. I haven't forgotten about it, which was had to do with ethics, that honesty is a virtue. So let's now turn to that one here. Already filled up the board here, so clear it out. These examples are covered in detail in the article on Platonistic theories of universals in the reading. So it's if you miss taking notes on any of this, it's all in there anyway. So, though I might use slightly different examples here. Make the same point. So if we start out with a new one now. Say that honesty is a virtue. You might think you could translate this on the model of redness is a color, which said, what was the translation of redness as a color? That all red things are colored things. So if we use that model here, we'd get all honest people or beings. Right? All honest beings are virtuous beings, if we use the model of red as a color. And apply it here, we'd get our one prime translation as honesty is a virtue is just a fancy highfalutin way of saying that all honest people are virtuous people. So we wouldn't be using these abstract nouns anymore like honesty and virtue, but rather concrete nouns like honest people and virtuous people. Okay? But would they be equivalent would be the question. It's true that honesty is a virtue. That seems not controversial. One that doesn't seem to be exemplified at the Republican debates, if you can believe what the various candidates are saying about each other, right? They're accusing each other of being liars constantly, right? But nonetheless, honesty is a virtue is true, but is it true that necessarily, therefore, that all honest people are virtuous? Or could we imagine somebody who's honest but not virtuous? What would be an example of such a case?
Criminal, crime.
Yeah, a criminal. Yeah, suppose you have suppose you have a serial killer who is extremely honest, and whenever asked, will freely confess to. Right? Oh yes, I've killed these 47 people. This one's buried there. You can check it out. This one's buried in this other. Right? There are cases like that. Right? They're not merely possible, actually have been. Honest serial killers. Now, a serial killer wouldn't be virtuous, right? But he could be honest. So we can't say that all honest people are virtuous people is true. The problem is that turns out to be false, whereas the original statement's true, that honesty is a virtue. So the two statements aren't equivalent. So we can't translate the abstract statement, honesty is a virtue, as all honest people are virtuous people. So that's the problem for the nominalist here. So he's got to come up with a one double prime. Some other way to do this. That would be the issue. So it's perplexing, right? Clearly, the relation between red and color is not the same as between virtue and honesty. I mean, in one sense, one relation's the same. In each case, we have a species of a genus, right? Red is a species of the genus color, and honesty is a species of the genus virtue. Yet the relation between species and genus is more complex and less straightforward than it is in the case of colors. It doesn't work the same way. Which is odd, but there you have it, right? So one attempt to translate it might be to say that actually the original statement doesn't have a truth value at all. This is called the non-cognitivist strategy. One example of non-cognitivism in ethics is the thesis that claims about rightness and wrongness and virtue and so forth are actually neither true nor false. They don't express statements about facts in the world, but rather express an individual or a culture's commands or recommendations or prescriptions about how they feel people should behave. Like the Ten Commandments are put in the form of prescriptions rather than as statements. They say, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, right? And so on. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, and so on, right? So you have these commands. So if we turn one into a command, we could then say, well, this doesn't have a truth value at all. We could just say, well, it's just a fancy way of saying, be honest, exclamation point. And then we get rid of honesty and virtue and so forth. So it is kind of a high price to pay. I mean, it's to give up the thesis of moral realism that our claims about virtue and right and wrong and so forth correspond to factual matters in reality. Because some other society might have a totally opposite prescription, right? Like it might say, you know, murdering is really good, like a Nazi culture, right? Their prescription might be, right, be vicious, be dishonest, right? Right? So, so that would be pretty desperate, I think, to go to one double prime. I don't know that we want to go there. That would be giving up on the idea that there's any objective fact of the matter as to whether honesty is a virtue or not. It'd be a virtue for whoever commanded it expected it of others, and not a virtue for those who don't expect it of others. And that seems sort of extreme and possibly perverse. If we don't do that, we could go to one triple prime. And this one would say that an honest person to the extent that that person is honest is a virtuous person. So notice there's a certain kind of reduplication here, or repetition. So an honest person, to the extent that that person is honest, right, is a virtuous person. This is sort of saying, well, you could be partly virtuous, right, if you're honest, even if you're also a serial killer. The part of you that's honest is, right? To the extent that you're honest, you're virtuous, and you have all this other baggage which makes you vicious overall, right? But to the extent that the person's honest, the person's virtuous. So this would only involve concrete vocabulary. So maybe one's just a fancy way of saying one triple prime. Here the controversy is obviously going to be about the legitimacy of introducing this to the extent that locution. Is this something that we all readily understand without any special definition or explanation of what it means? Or is it something that requires some unpacking or analysis before it can be accepted? I think it would be very hard to explain what that means in terms of any kind of philosophical account without bringing back in universals kinds of things. So this may come down to kind of a stalemate here. I mean, those who think that to the extent, bringing in this to the extent that the person's honest locution is cheating are going to reject the translation and say that it's just sneaking in universals. Right. But those who say, no, we understand perfectly well what this is getting at. It's getting at this idea that you can be partly virtuous by virtue of being honest. And who is 100% virtuous, right? Nobody, except God or whatever. Right? So I think this one ends in kind of a stalemate over that issue as far as I can see in terms of this strategy of using to extent that thing. Other philosophers have used the Latin term qua, Q-U-A, in the same kind of way. They've said an honest person, qua honest, is a virtuous person. Right? Considering just, right? Considering just that he's honest, he's virtuous. But if you were to say, well, what that means is considering just the aspect of his honesty, whatever, he's virtuous, then of course you'd be using universal. So you can't explain it that way. You just have to accept it as a basic undefined expression, which may be okay or may not be. So there's going to be a kind of disagreement about that, perhaps, and no easy way to resolve that disagreement. So maybe honesty as a virtue can be translated that way for the nominalist. Maybe not. That would be a topic for further deep philosophical explorations. Any question or comment at this point about that? Is there any other way to do this? Well, if we're willing to adopt the trope theory, remember that, which says that there's like a particular catness and a particular dogness, right? Then we wouldn't be simplistic or pure or austere, maximally parsimonious nominalists. We'd be bringing in these particular qualities, saying, well, they're particulars, so they're okay. We don't have universals. It'd be fairly straightforward to translate this if you have tropes. What could you say? You could say any particular honesty, right? Right? Right, is a particular, well, I guess we could say something like an honesty trope is a virtue trope, where trope refers to these particular qualities, like the particular catness of Mars, and the particular honesty of Socrates, and the particular virtue of Aristotle, and so on. So we could go that way, but then we wouldn't be materialists anymore. We'd be bringing in these curious particulars, but it's still nominalistic. So if you're willing to bring in tropes, you'd get one quadruple prime, an honesty trope is a virtue trope. So that'd be okay if you're willing to buy into the existence of particularized qualities as particulars, as opposed to shareable universals, where they can resemble one another and so on. But it's not particularly austere form of nominalism. Finally, I think we could use one quintuple prime here, which is going to use that trick from the Honda example. So we might say And this might be the best translation of all for the nominalist. They say, if X is an honest if X is an honest person and X and Y are as similar X and Y are as similar given that as an honest person and a non-honest person can be. Right. Then, okay, so if X is an honest person, I'm sorry, and Y is not, left that out. Okay, so if X is honest and Y isn't, and X and Y are as similar as an honest person and a non-honest person can be to one another, right? Then it is at least probable that X is more morally virtuous than Y. So this is telling us that honesty is a virtue. Right, that X is going to be more, it's going to be at least probable that X is more morally virtuous than Y. If they're as similar as can be, except that one of them is honest and the other isn't honest. This is, I guess, a kind of way of unpacking that to the extent that talk, right? You might say. I don't really have a refutation of that one. So. But if you do, I'd be happy to hear it as a refutation of it as an equivalent of the original one. So if you get this honest person and this non-honest person who are as similar as they can be otherwise, right? So it's got that modal term in there, right? Similar as they could possibly be. Yeah. Then it's going to be probable, at least, that X, the honest person, is more morally virtuous than Y. Yeah. And so we have this relation of being more morally virtuous than doing justice to the idea, as I said earlier, that for human beings, at least, moral virtue always comes in degrees. There is no, like, 100% virtuous person. You all remember the story of the cynic philosopher Diogenes, who walked around ancient Greece wearing a barrel and holding a lantern whenever He lived in the barrel when he had this lantern. And people would ask him, "What the heck are you up to? What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm searching for an honest man with a lantern, whatever. I'll move out of the barrel into an apartment when I find one." Yeah. He was the same fellow who, when he happened to run into Alexander the Great, Alexander said, "Oh, great Diogenes, we've heard stories about your great wisdom as a philosopher and sage. I grant you any wish that, any request that you might make, whatever it is. Emperor of the known universe." And Diogenes said, "Please step aside, you're blocking the sunlight." That's the kind of guy Diogenes was, whatever. But he was a cynic and didn't believe that there were any completely virtuous people. Perhaps even that there weren't any completely honest people as well, which would entail that there are no completely virtuous people. That seems pretty hard to dispute. All right, so looks like nominalists can deal with this case as well, at least if we allow him to use modal vocabulary, which seems, as far as this argument goes, okay. This argument has to do with translation, not with the claim that modality cannot be understood without abstract entities or shareable properties or anything of that sort. That's not what's being argued. Just saying we must have a concrete translation. Well, there's nothing abstract about the word can, so it seems fine to use that here. So far the nominalist appears to be winning here. Able to find good translations of all these things. What about this one? Unicornicity is other than diabolicity. So what would that say? Unicornicity is the property of being a unicorn, and diabolicity is the property of being diabolical or devilish, right? We all know that unicorns are very nice creatures, magical creatures, that can only be seen by those who are pure of heart. So clearly these would be different properties, right? Devils. Of course, neither exists, right? So it's not clear we can find an equivalent for this in terms of things that exist, like there are unicorns and they're not devils, or there are devils and they're not all unicorns. That won't work because neither exists, right? Yet we would affirm this, right? That these are, being a unicorn is a different property than being a devil, basically. I think again here modality would have to be used to capture this. So the translation, I guess, would be possibly there are unicorns that are not devils. And possibly there are devils that are not unicorns. Or maybe there should be an or. I'm not sure. Either one will work. Possibly there are unicorns that are not devils, or possibly there are devils that are not unicorns. So here we're just talking about concrete things that don't exist. So we're not committing ourselves to anything except that certain things are possible. So that seems like a pretty good translation. Of that one. So let's get to the really tough ones now. What if we take this statement? There are shapes that are never exemplified. This strikes me from a mathematical and common sense perspective as being a true statement. We can think of lots of shapes, mathematically viable shapes that are studied by those in geometry and topology, and so forth, that nothing actually has. Say the shape of a regular polygon that has a googolplex of sides, say. So a googol is 10 to the 100th power, and a googolplex is 10 to the googol. So it's 10 to the 10 to the 100th. So to write this number out, you'd have to write out 10 followed by 10 to the 100 zeros. Right, 10 to the 10 to the 100th power. So the claim is that there's no regular polygon. That's a polygon that has exactly equal sides, right? Like a hexagon or something. That instead of having 6 sides, has a googolplex, a number of exactly equal straight sides. It seems like the probability of there being such an object in the universe ever is insignificant, right? So doesn't seem like any such object would exist. Or you could take some other weird object, like a hypercube with a, say, say, not in the 5th dimension, but say with 114 dimension, say 114 dimensional hypercube. It's the analog of a cube, except that it's got 114 dimensions instead of 3. So they have all these kinds of objects in geometry study. They don't seem to ever exist. So the properties, the shapes wouldn't be exemplified. So how do we translate that there are shapes that are never exemplified? Plato thought that actually none of the ordinary shapes we think of are ever exemplified, like a circle. Right? He thought that the only true circle was in heaven, but in the physical world, you would never find a perfectly round object. So once we drop the Platonic theory that there is a heaven containing all these perfectly round and square and triangular things, and that these things are just properties which don't have shapes themselves. They're abstract entities. Then it looks like Plato's argument applies that even being round or being a sphere is a shape that's never exemplified, because any object in the physical world will always have some deviation from being a perfect sphere or a triangle or circle or whatever. There'll always be some little bump somewhere along the edge. Right. Or even if you make it out of light beams, like cross 3 light beams to like get a triangle. They say that there are these gravity waves that are undulating through the universe, that are rippling, right? So that they won't be perfectly straight. There'll be tiny little little squiggles on the side. From the collisions of black holes billions of years ago that are now reverberating through the cosmos, causing the very fabric of space-time to warp slightly, little ripples. Which was basically the idea Plato had, which was that the physical world is in constant chaos and flux. You don't really have anything that meets the standards of geometry. So all these shapes would be unexemplified, just like with the virtues. Right? So I guess there are virtues that are never exemplified, could also be another example, like honesty. Right. So how would we translate this one? Could we say that it seems like we only have like 2 choices here. We either have to break shapes up into all the different kinds of shaped objects that there are. So what would be some kinds of shaped objects that are concrete, like triangular objects and round objects? And so on. Right. Or we could talk about shaped objects, just in general, rather than shapes. So we might try, there are shaped objects that never exist. Would that make any sense, though? This would say that there exist shaped objects that don't exist. Would that be true? That there exist shaped objects that don't exist? Or would that be a contradiction and therefore false? It seems strictly speaking it would contradict itself by saying that there exist shaped objects that don't exist. So would make that false, whereas the original would be true, so it wouldn't be a good translation. Any question about what I'm saying? That's not going to work. That's just gibberish, right? That there exist shaped objects that don't exist. That's no good. So we could try like listing all the kinds of particular shaped objects. Okay, so either there are never any circular things, or there are never any triangular things. So now we're just talking about things, so this is concrete discourse. Or there are never any square things. Or there are never any pentagonal things. So it's got to be one of these, right? If there are shapes that are never exemplified, it's got to be either because there are never any of those, or never any of those, or never any of those. Or Yeah, but now I'm starting to get like writer's cramp because it's getting so long. Will it ever end? It doesn't seem like it could end, right? We'd have to go on forever, which would mean we'd never get a translation if we go on like this, right? We got to be able to actually produce a translation that we can write down. Otherwise, we don't have a translation. So how could we, is there any way to circumvent the need to write out infinitely many of these clauses, each one saying that there are never any of these and never any of these kinds of concrete things, these concrete things? Well, one way that I can think of would be to use the trick of the 3 dots, which is called an ellipsis. So you could say, or, dot, 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 and then you could stop. You'd have a finite thing. It just has to keep on going. Right. That might be cheating, though, to do that. I mean, eventually you get out to the thing that has a Googleplex number of size and so on, right? And so on. And of course, this only deals with the objects that have straight sides. There would be objects that also have like curvy sides and whatever. So you'd have to have all those in there also. It would get very, very long. Infinite for sure, right? Like way infinite. Right? More infinite even than the number of natural numbers. Because there are more shapes. Shapes map on to the real numbers. So natural numbers are infinite, but there's less of them. This would be like the number of real numbers of shapes. So there's no way you could ever get it done, for sure. Yeah, so if you have a series, which is what this is, like one, like say 2, 4, 6, dot, dot, dot. So you can do that sort of thing, right? And what would the next number be in this series? 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, so how do we know that it's 8? How do we know that? Yeah, well, it's because we know that we're following a certain rule called a rule of expansion, which defines which numbers fall in the sequence. And the rule here is keep on adding 2. So that's the rule, right? So it's called a rule of expansion, and you have to know what the rule of expansion is, and you have to be able to state the rule of expansion. So here, in this case, the rule of expansion is add 2. So if we could define the rule of expansion there, then we could do it. If we could define that rule without bringing in any abstract universals, without entailing the existence of abstract universals. So how could we define the rule of expansion for these 3 dots? That would be for the nominalist. Can you do it without presupposing universals? Arguably not. At least I don't see how you do it without bringing in universals. It seems like what we're being asked to do is to keep on going until every possible kind of shaped object is included. For any possible kind of shaped object. Dot, 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 for any possible kind of shaped object is what this is in effect telling us to do. For any possible kind, like that would bring in all the polygons and all the curved things. For any possible kind of shaped object, which a shaped object is a concrete reference, so that's okay. But what about a possible kind of shaped object? That doesn't sound too concrete. It's not just that it brings in possibility, it also brings in kind of shaped object, including ones that are not found anywhere in the concrete world. Right? all these 114-dimensional hypercubes and Google plexagons and so on, right? So it seems like that brings back in abstract shapes. What would a possible kind of shaped object be if not some kind of shareable universal? So this seems to be an abject failure here. Persuaded? I think it's a pretty powerful argument that this translation is not going to get us there. So we got to try something else here. We're allowed to talk about possibility, but possible kinds, however, is another. We're not talking here about merely actual kinds, but also non-actual possible kinds. By the very nature of the translation effort, we need to refer to those, to the ones that are not exemplified, that can correspond to the shapes that are not exemplified, which would be non-actual possible kinds of shape objects, which seems to take us right back to the idea of there being such unexemplified properties as being a regular polygon with 10 to the 100th number of sides, or 10 to the 10 to the 100th number of sides, and so on and so on. So that one's not going to get us anywhere. We could try, however, a de re locution. We could try this as a translation. Something like any shaped object is possibly shaped differently than. Possibly shaped differently than itself or any other shaped object. Something along those lines. So this is using the de re locution. So there's no contradiction, right? You're not saying that there are shaped objects, that possibly there are shaped objects that don't exist, or that there are shaped objects that are shaped differently than any shaped object. Like that. What you're saying is that any shaped object could be shaped differently than it is or than anything else is. If that's true, then it seems to follow that there are shapes that are unexemplified, right? The question is, does the fact that there are shapes that are unexemplified entail this? That any shaped object could be shaped differently than it is? I would argue not. The ancient philosopher, the ancient atomistic philosopher Democritus, held that there were fundamental particles, each of which had a shape, and these particles were indivisible and immutable. They couldn't be changed. Their shapes couldn't change. Like you might have tiny little spheres or tiny little triangles or tiny little curved little things and so on. And he said that the various, given the various shapes that the objects had, they clung together in various, they would sort of like interlock like Legos and build up bigger, more complex things. The key thing was, though, that these fundamental particles were immutable, so that it was not possible for them to be shaped differently than they were. So it could be true that we have an atomistic universe, but that it's possible that there be atoms of other kinds shaped differently than the atoms that actually exist, right? So the original statement that there are shapes that are never exemplified could be true, because the atoms don't exemplify every shape, only some subset of the possible shapes are found in the atoms. It wouldn't follow, though, that those atoms are possibly shaped differently than themselves or any other shaped object, right? Because it might be that they couldn't change their shapes. So it looks like atomism is inconsistent with this kind of translation using a de re locution. So that won't work either. The only thing I can think of that would work is not merely going to commit us to using modal terms, which we've said is fine, but actually to using possible worlds talk, which is a whole further step, and a particular theory of possible worlds, not just any theory of possible. Obviously not an abstract worlds theory, but kind of the David Lewis concrete worlds theory. If we assume that, then I think we could translate there are shapes that are never exemplified. How? As so there are shapes that are never exemplified. If we're willing to accept all this baggage, we could then say there is a non-actual possible world in which there are objects that are shaped differently than anything in the actual world. I guess these two would be equivalent. But this is to presuppose not just the concept of possibility, but of a highly controversial, unquestionable theory of possible worlds, according to which possible worlds are concrete universes that are causally and spatiotemporally isolated and separate from our actual universe, in which all these other kinds of shaped objects exist. So, yeah, if you're willing to go that far, then you can translate it. But as we've seen, there are many objections to the concrete world's model. So this would be a highly contentious translation. So it looks like there may be some truths about things like shapes and numbers and moral virtues which resist the attempts of nominalists to capture them in terms of a wholly concrete vocabulary. And if that's true, then until they are translated, and we haven't proven that there is no possible translation, but until the nominalist comes up with the translation, there seems to be practical reason to accept the existence of these shareable universals like shapes, perhaps moral virtues, and so on. I guess once one has let some of these in, then the rest of them will come flooding in as well, as Russell commented. If you're going to allow some universals, you may as well allow the others as well, like species of animals and things like that. Let me turn finally to the modal argument. So there's a modal argument for universals, which gets you into these same issues about abstract versus concrete models of possible worlds and such. But basic idea of it can be found on page 12 of the article on Platonic theories of universals. So the argument goes like this. Premise 1 says there are non-obtaining possibilities. For example, there being winged quadrupeds, four-legged winged things, like the a hippogriff in Harry Potter, right? Doesn't actually exist, but it's possible to have a creature like that. You imagine some odd turns of evolution they could have evolved on a different planet. So there are non-obtaining possibilities. So was my example there being winged quadrupeds? Okay, and then premise A2 says that a non-obtaining possibility is not a concrete entity. A3, necessarily every entity is either concrete or abstract. Therefore, there are abstract, non-obtaining possibilities. A5. Okay. These abstract, non-obtaining possibilities have necessary existence. How could they not, right? What would make them not exist, right? I mean, they exist here where the winged quadrupeds don't exist, and they also exist where the winged quadrupeds do exist, so they exist in all possible situations. So they have necessary existence. I have necessary being. They cannot fail to exist. It's impossible for them not to exist. If there are abstract, non-obtaining possibilities having necessary existence, then Platonic realism is true. I'm just going to say if there are such non-obtaining possibilities. Then Platonic. Realism is true. Hence, Platonic realism is true. One's going to either have to say that there are abstract, shareable properties like being a winged quadruped, or one's going to have to say that there are non-obtaining states of affairs or propositions like there being a winged quadruped. But an abstract proposition like there being a winged quadruped plausibly has as constituents, as one of its constituents, the property of being a winged quadruped. So we're back. I mean, if you look at what that proposition is made of, one of its constituents is the shareable property of being a winged quadruped. Or the shareable property of being winged. Or the shareable property of being a quadruped. Some kind of shareable property makes up, is one of the things that makes up the proposition that there are winged quadrupeds. So through this chain of reasoning, it looks like Platonic realism is true. David Lewis would deny premise 2, saying that a non-obtaining possibility is a concrete entity. It's a thing in another concrete world that we can't travel to. But as we've seen, there are pretty powerful arguments disputing that view. So on that note, I will stop for today, and we'll resume on Thursday, hopefully, weather permitting.